I want to talk about Clifford Stone, because you know that here in Mexico nobody knows, and I think that Clifford Stone is one of the pieces of all this puzzle, taking in consideration the UFO crash. You told me yesterday that you know him, and I have some questions about it. But the first one is he really worked for the Mondos project and Blue Flight project?
Clifford Stone had contact when he was young, as a child. And the Army knew that he had contact, because when you have contact as a child, you have telepathy. And Clifford's mother used to charge the neighbors $10 to have a reading from this child that had telepathy. So the Army sent a colonel to follow Clifford through his life. When Clifford graduated from high school, he entered the Army under this colonel. The colonel knew Clifford had telepathy and had contact with a being named Corona. Clifford told me that Corona seemed like a little boy when he was, he would sit at the table, he would walk around the house, and he looked like a little boy, but he was an extraterrestrial. The colonel knew this. So the colonel said, Clifford, at 16, you will be part of a special unit. You will do nuclear biological cleanup. So it's called the NBC unit. Clifford did not know it was cleanup of UFOs.
I see.
He thought he was cleaning up nuclear waste. So Clifford, when he entered the Army, was part of a very select group of men. And the reason is because he had this ability. In 1969, in Indian Town Gap, Indiana, was his first crash. He was with all of his colleagues, all the Army young boys, and there was a UFO that had crashed in Indiana in 1969. And he walked close to it, and he became afraid. He said, I need a commander here. I need a commander. I need, and they said, no, son, young man, you go up there by yourself and tell us what you see. In that crash, there were 4 dead gray aliens, 2 outside the hatch and 2 inside. And that was the first time Clifford understood that he was part of a unit to retrieve crash and bodies. And bodies. The other men had stayed back, and they made him go because he had telepathic abilities. He understood that later. He was never told that. Never told that. Years later, he knew he was part of Moon Dust, Project Moon Dust, and Blue Fly. These were secret projects to retrieve crash. I was surprised as a journalist that there were crashes in the United States. One of the last crashes, he said, was in the state of Georgia.
In which year?
Georgia. I don't know what city. I didn't get to ask him which city. But it was recently. Which year? It was like, I think, in the 1980s, 1980-something, because he talked about that was one of the last ones, because the protocol for that was to leave the bodies, if they were dead, near the crash site outside, and the next day the beings would come and get their bodies. because they had enough bodies, they had enough material that they didn't need to take every time the bodies. He did tell me that 3 of the retrievals were in Vietnam, and it was very difficult because when they came to get him, it was Christmas. He had to get on a commercial flight, and they blindfolded everybody so that they would not know where they were landing, but he knew it was the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. He recognized it because he had worked in Vietnam. He married a Vietnam woman. He opened an orphanage in Vietnam, Clifford. Big heart. Always connected to, he said, the visitors. He called them the visitors. And they knew about him. Because when he went to Vietnam, there was a cave in Vietnam, a cave, where one side was transparent and the beings were watching the war. And Clifford and his platoon were supposed to blow up the cave. They had explosives. And they walked into the cave, and the being, who he said looked very amphibian, but it was a person. He said even had gills like a fish. He said, "What are you doing here, Clifford?" Right to Clifford. And they threw the explosives. The army, to destroy the cave. They know that we are being watched. They know that some of these beings are in caves. They know a great deal. Clifford was very upset because he said in that particular time he was blown out of the cave and he detached his retina on his eye. He said, but right away he was cured. Right away, he said, the beings fixed his retina. So they understood that his mission was to destroy them if they were considered the enemy, but they also knew that Clifford was in communication with them. So it was very difficult for him. One of the reasons my colleagues do not touch Clifford Stone, do not talk to Clifford Stone, is because he cries a lot. He gets emotional. When he retells a story of contact, tears come down his eyes and he relives the story. But he told me that the government in general, or a group of the government, this is only Army now, knows who has contact. They know these people have telepathic abilities, and they follow them throughout childhood. So I was very interested in this, because I've heard this before. I've heard this story before from other military men who were in the UFO field, that they've had contact when they were young, somebody knows, and they are invited into programs, secret programs, to do things.
Very interesting. All the UFO crash that Clifford recovered, he described the same aspect. I mean, referring to race.
No, they were all different. They were different. And just before he died, I said, "Why did you say there were 57 different races?"
Right.
57. Colonel Corso said 52. Okay, Colonel Corso, when you read the book, Conversation with Colonel Corso, he said the Pentagon has 52 written down. The reason, and there is a reason Clifford said it, he had a book. He had a manual, a first aid manual. First aid, that means if you come and there's a being that is, hurt, like in Virginia, the being that was hurt, you have to know not to put alcohol or not to put medicine, not to do anything that will kill him. So they want them alive. So you have a manual, and I said, well, was there a picture? He said, no, there's drawing of the being. drawing of the being, the characteristics of the being. And he said, I had that in my hand. He said, so I had 57 different races. And he was honest about it. And it makes sense, it's logical, that there are different races visiting the planet. One thing I want to share with you, Carlos, though, he said none of the ones that he ever encountered were hostile.